things will never be the same. Because the hierarchy of power in the Bionicle universe is about to change.
Gathered friends. As I've begun work on my Bionicle lore videos, I've made a few conclusions to myself regarding certain sources that have been cited on Biosector and other sites regarding canon. Canon is often a very, not so much controversial, but it's often very much debated all the time. Not just in Bionicle, but throughout any fandom. Oftentimes throughout mediums and IPs, we will find sources that are canon that will contradict one another, or maybe something was retconned. Because I've been noticing some weird little things while doing research on various characters that I mentioned in my poll earlier this week. And for the sake of future videos, I'm making this as like a guide video for how I generally view Bionicle canon, and essentially how I sort through it. What things get prioritized and what things get disregarded and what things are just straight up not canon. This video is supposed to help a lot of new fans who maybe want to get into the Bionicle lore or are just confused on what's important, like what should they be prioritizing. So I'll begin that now. So if there are any Star Wars legends watching the video, you might find this this example quite familiar. So what I'm showing you here is basically the hierarchy of canon for Star Wars back before the Disney takeover, back before the Disney buyout. And essentially, it sorts canon in terms of like whatever is at the top or whatever is above the other is what will override the previous canon. Because if you're unfamiliar with Star Wars Legends, or what was otherwise known as the Extended Universe, the EU, there were a lot of stories that ended up contradicting each other, and of course with shows like the Clone Wars coming out, they did scrap a lot of Legends continuity from the earlier 2000s. For George Lucas canon, it is just episodes 1 to 6. It's just that. Clone Wars bleeds in there, in and out, but I'll get to that later. We get to the tier below it, which is television. So this is where the Clone Wars mainly falls under. Again, so like if anything happens in a film, like if George Lucas made episode 7 and he made something that contradicted the 2008 Clone Wars show, then obviously then that would be decanonized in the 2008 Clone Wars show. I won't go through the entire hierarchy here, like the entire essentially tier list, but you get the general idea. There's the George canon, which is the main 1 to 6. You have the TV show canon, which is like anything that's a TV show. That's like second most important to the films. And then there's the continuity canon and secondary canon. So I have gone out of my way to make one for Bionicle. The top canon is M canon, which is main canon. And for this, I put books and serials, as that was the primary source of Bionicle's story. That was like what was the most polished and improved from the Lego group. You had people like Greg working on it, things like that. And of course the sets. The sets above all else are what is like canon for redesign. So no matter how much I like my revamp of a certain canon character, it will never be canon because the official retail set is the canon design, unfortunately. But it is what it is. I feel like the novels and books are very, very easy to self-explain themselves. They're the easiest to cite. They go into the most detail. They make everything as perfectly clear as possible. So the next one I have here is MM canon, or Multimedia canon. So that includes the comics, film, and animation. And within animation, I am including Minog. Minog, while it is a video game, it portrays the events extremely well of the story, and it is still canon for the most part. There are things that Greg has said is not canon, but we'll get to the Greg stuff later down the line. So for the comics, I have just below like the novels and serials, just because they're slightly more simplified than the main books and the main serials. However, There are some things in the comics that aren't covered in the main books and main serials, and you can still cite them perfectly fine with no issue. It's officially released content. So they are definitely above the film and animation. And then for film and animation, with the Bionicle Miramax films, for example, there are certain things about them that are not necessarily canon per se, but the general events of those films went the same. The designs are obviously like not really the canon ones, like the retail sets the retail sets are the canon depictions of them. In terms of like people saying like what's not canon about them, I don't know specifically what people say about them like aren't specifically canon. But so basically in this category it includes media that's like probably the most accessible that people have checked out, if they're not like a bookworm, if they're not a book reader per se. But there are various little things about these properties that have been like retconned a little bit here and there. There's some things that are like questionable, to say the least about. But obviously, like these, again, like you can perfectly cite these in a canon debate. I don't see anyone having an issue with that per se. Now the next here we have the L canon, which is the Lego canon contest canon. So basically anything that was from an officially held Lego canon contest, such as like the Dark Hunters contest, like those are, again, they just add more to like official character designs. Nothing too much to go too deep into here. That's essentially what this category just is, held by the official Lego group. While they may not have been given the thumbs up by guys like Greg or other members of the story team, the Lego group owns the IP, and they will determine what's canon and what's not, and the people that were a part of the contest were the ones that determined what was canon out of those contests. So next category is game canon, and I'm gonna say right away, I do not mean all of the games. So there are a few games on here that are canon, that often get disregarded or just forgotten about, such as Maze of Shadows for the Game Boy, along with the Bionicle, the video game where you play as Takua. These are often forgettable titles and are rather super obscure, even if you are a Bionicle fan. But they are canon, they don't contradict anything, and they are held to a similar standard as all the stuff above this list. So here is the border here. Here is the first border that I'm introducing, and it is the last border. And essentially, this is the gray area. Everything going forward is in the gray area. You can take it or leave it type of thing. These are simply things that were not approved directly by the Lego group. While characters such as Greg work for Lego and may have done some Q&As in the past, none of those Q&As before or even after G1's story ended really fell under his jurisdiction, but a lot of his points end up contributing to canon for some reason. For me, and not just really for me, but just as like a rule of thumb with literally anything, if it's not written in the page, if it's not written on a serial, then you gotta wait for it to be put on another official thing for it to be like locked in. So I know this part's gonna upset some people, but next up we got G canon, which is Greg canon. So let me explain why the Greg stuff is a lot lower than a lot of you were probably expecting. When I say the Greg stuff, I specifically just mean the suggestions or Q&A answers that he has given throughout the years. You see, Greg is often regarded as like the George Lucas or the Tolkien of Bionicle, specifically when it comes to Bionicle's story. However, a lot of people tend to forget this or just simply don't know this, but Greg came on Bionicle's team later, after it was already made for the most part. So a lot of what he ended up bringing in were simply retcons, or he was continuing stories that were set up for him. And to call him the George Lucas of Bionicle is accurate to various degrees. Of course, with the hand that he had in the story going forward, but also with the things that he has controversially done. But many have given Greg this weird authority that like he's the all-knowing guy, even though you look at someone like George Lucas, and George Lucas was someone that actually created Star Wars himself, and then had help from artists such as Ralph McQuarrie to really expand upon it. while Greg kind of hopped on while things were already rolling. Even when Greg had a lot of power during G1, he was often overridden a lot by LEGO themselves. For instance, for 2008 storyline, it was supposed to be another year for the Toa Inika, otherwise known as the Toa Mari, but LEGO, they were the ones that said, nope, it's going to be the Toa Nuva, and he was like, okay. And then they were like, okay, we're going to awake Madanui, and he was like, well, that's too early. It's like, well, we're going to do it anyway, regardless, and he was like, okay. So, essentially, while he was Bionicle's head writer, he was the writer to be commissioned for stories that LEGO wanted to make, or the people in charge of Bionicle wanted to make. He's not Mr. Bionicle. So a lot of these Q&A answers and message board posts along with suggestions are put in this gray area due to the fact that a lot of these either just simply don't make a lot of sense, or were kind of given just for the sake of giving an answer to, such as when George Lucas was asked by Jon Stewart what planet Obi-Wan was from.
We know pretty much where everybody's from except for Obi-Wan.
Obi-Wan?
Yeah, where's he from? What's his home planet? Don't make it up. You gotta say where he's actually from.
I wouldn't do that. This is something
right.
that was one of the first things that I wrote in the very first script.
Really?
Yeah, he comes from the planet Stujung.
That's permanently canon because George Lucas said it. So what I'm saying is, Greg does not have the George Lucas all-ruling reign over Bionicle per se. He was put in charge of its story after G1 had ended. So the serials that he would post, to me at least, those are official canon because they were released under LEGO officially. But all these other Q&A things are asking an author what you would do in this scenario, essentially, and then the author would give you a raw idea feedback decision that maybe they would regret making and then go back and rewrite it, because that's what writers do. That's what writing is. Writing is rewriting. So just because Greg says something in the moment doesn't necessarily mean that was gonna stick, or if he had more time to polish the idea, maybe it would be different. Or maybe all of these are were perfectly planned out, and that's just the way that he would want to pretend to go about it, just like an author like J.K. Rowling per se. But those are my justifications for putting this category in this gray area. If it's not released in an official capacity, then it's just a bunch of garbly goo. And honestly, you can probably just pick and choose at this point. Okay, so the next category is these last two, including this one I'm about to say, are definitely the most controversial ones. So the next one is the community-held canon contests, otherwise known as C-canon on this lists. So for example, you had the TTV canon contests for Toa Hellrex, the Toa Haga, and Artaka. Just like the official LEGO-held contests, these were all fan designs, and there was an actual voting system. However, while there was a voting system, there was also a judge-based veto decision. That being with members of the TTV and other members of the community, and then ultimately showing it to Greg for a thumbs up, and that's what makes something canon now. Again, while Greg was an employee at LEGO at this time, it's not really something that was given to him as an ability under his jurisdiction of the brand. Releasing serials in official capacity is one thing, but just looking at a picture someone gave you and asked, is this canon, yes or no, is another. To use another example of Greg, in the past, a fan asked him if a certain Toa, Toa Neho's Kanohi, could be a Kanohi Huna, and he said, sure, why not? There was fan backlash behind that for whatever reason, and then Greg just made that, the guy that asked him to do that was like, hey, could you, make it not canon? And then he was like, yeah, sure. So, it's really just, do you see what I mean here? Again, while it may have a LEGO, or a former LEGO employee's stamp of approval, it does not have the stamp of approval of the Bionicle team, which were the people in charge of the designs primarily. which did not fall under Greg's jurisdiction, and also doesn't make sense with the permissions that he was given after G1's cancellation. So again, this is another, since it's in the gray area, it is pick and choose. I like most of the canon contest designs. The Toa Helrix one, for instance, I think is greatly improved by the Bucky design. The Toa Haga I quite like. I would just tweak some of them just a bit to make them more cohesive as like a set mock. Because the purpose of those were to make them more consistent with the official Toa Haga sets, which were Toa Norik and Toa Aruni. And the Artaka mock, along with the Mask of Creation design, I go back and forth on. I'll probably just end up making my own Artaka at some point and to just do that. It just doesn't look like it just doesn't line up with G1's design language for me to really accept that one personally, even though it is technically like canon on like Biosector and like other reliable Bionicle archive sites. So while technically canon, going by the logic of list, it is up to you liking it or not liking it, and then coming to your own conclusions there. So the next category, which is a border while also being the last tier, is N canon, or otherwise known as a straight up not canon. So Bionicle Heroes, straight up not canon. While it may adapt some of the story beats, it's completely not canon. It's Bionicle fast food. I love Bionicle fast food, but it's Bionicle fast food. What can I say? The commercials as well, it kind of falls under that Bionicle Heroes category where like they loosely adapt the story, but they're just, sometimes they'll make big changes or just things that don't line up with the story team's decisions. Like the commercials for the Baraki, for instance. Those were sort of adapted into canon as like dream sequences, but that was obviously not the intent of the commercial. But yeah, that essentially covers my Bionicle canon hierarchy tier list. Do you agree with this? Which points do you not agree with? I'd love to hear it in the comments. Please keep it civil, and remember, at the end of the day, this is all just my opinion. None of my opinion can override fact. Just like how Greg can't override LEGO when they want to bring back the Toa Nuva in 2008 and he wanted to make it another Inika year. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. If you didn't enjoy it, leave a dislike. And I'll see you in the next one.